But for tonight, I want to deal with, I get asked a lot of questions by clients, by people in recovery, about recovery. And once they get to know about complex trauma, I usually get a bunch more questions. So I want to give some of those questions to you tonight, just in case you're asking them and you've never had them answered. And then over the years, I've kept track of fears that people have in recovery. Some of the fears are actually healthy fears. Some of the fears are very debilitating fears, even irrational fears. So I want to talk about some of the common questions and some of the common fears. So question number one, and this probably is the one I get most as people learn about complex trauma. They go, uh-oh, what have I done to my kids? And then they go, uh-oh, are they going to go down the same path that I went down? And that causes a lot of anxiety, often a lot of fear, and it can take them to a really dark place in their own mind of feeling guilt and beating themselves up. So let me see if I can answer that in as fair and helpful a way as possible. So is it possible that your kids will go down the same path as you? Yes, it is. Does that mean that they will go down the same path? Not necessarily. Now, what we know about trauma, and it's one of the sad things, is that traumatized people pass that on to their children, who pass it on to the next generation and the next generation. So sadly, trauma becomes one of those generational things that gets passed on very easily. That does not mean that it can't be stopped. And that's the part I want you to understand. What will make a difference in your child's life so that they don't go down the road that you went down? It's not that you preach at them. It's not that you drag them to a counselor or to finding freedom. It's that they see you changing. They see you becoming healthier and becoming a safe person. That has a greater impact on them than any counselor, any program. And so if you're concerned about your children, the place to start is taking care of your stuff so that you are growing and you are becoming healthier. So that's the big answer. Now let me just give you a couple other things with that. If your children were part of your life when you were using, it doesn't matter if they didn't see you using, it still affected them. And they probably know a lot more about what you were doing than you think they know. And they probably have a lot of fear already inside of them. But I want you to understand this, that as you get healthy, they're going to love and hate you at the same time. There are going to be some days when they're mad at you and lashing out all of that built up anger for how you hurt them. And they're still trying to process that. But yet they're proud of you that you're changing and growing, and they love you and they don't want to lose you again, and they want a relationship with you. And so some days you're not going to know, is this person crazy today or is this person good today? And it can switch on a dime depending if they are triggered. So be prepared for that. What is also going on is not just that they're dealing with all the hurt and the anger inside, and there will come a time when they need to talk to you about that, but they're also dealing with how you broke their trust. And they want to trust you, but they're afraid to trust you. And so they have all kinds of radars in place looking for any sign that you might relapse. And often they see your warning signs before you do. And often when they sense that you're not in a good place, like you might have been 2 days ago, they will start acting out without even realizing what they're doing. They're acting out of a subconscious place of fear, and they're lashing out at you. But they are having trouble trusting you. Next thing I want you to see is the danger that many parents fall into is this. I am determined my child will not go down the same road as I went down, So I will be a control freak parent. I will control every detail of their life to make sure they don't make the mistakes I did. Do you realize that usually backfires? And it usually makes them rebel even more and more determined to go down the same path that you chose. So part of parenting, after you have created complex trauma for your children and you are working on healing, part of parenting is you have to turn your kids over to a higher power or just to trust. Because you cannot control their decisions after a certain age. And the more you try to, the more you cause them to rebel. So be aware of that. Next thing, your children will get triggered by certain things that you do, and you will get triggered by certain things that they do. But sometimes when they get triggered, they will make bad decisions. They will say things or do things that cause you to panic that they're starting down that road that you went down. And in that moment, you feel this panic and desperation, and it is very easy for you to lash out at them in hurtful ways to try and get their attention and to get them to hear you, and you always regret it later. So be aware of those times when you're feeling desperate, when you might be tempted to take away a whole bunch of filters and say things that you're later going to regret. So that's question one. That is a common question, but it is a big question. It's an important question. Bottom line, work on yourself. You will be amazed how that affects how your children work on themselves. Next question. Should I take my kids to a counselor? So you see them starting to act out. You see them starting to cut themselves, have eating issues, all kinds of different things. And you panic and you go, should I take them to a counselor? That is a tricky, tricky question. There's not a right or wrong answer. So I want you to think about some of the factors that you need to consider in deciding that question. So number one, if your child is a very sensitive child, if you take them to a counselor, it is a super scary experience for them, almost traumatic. Because what you're doing is putting them in an office with these big grown-ups that they don't know, asking them hard personal questions, and it scares them and can be traumatizing. So just be aware of where your child is at. Secondly, be aware of how your child perceives what you're doing. It is very easy for the child to get the shame message that I'm a problem. I am the problem in this family. I am causing my parents all kinds of pain and concern. That can be very negative message in their mind, and it can start them further down the shame road, which is not a good road. Secondly, with that, many children think this way. My parents are all concerned that I'm cutting myself, and they just want to fix me and get me to stop cutting, but nobody wants to know why I'm cutting. Nobody wants to know the pain underneath. They just want to fix the symptom. And if your child perceives that you're just wanting to fix the symptom, guess who they conclude you care about? Yourself. You just want to feel better, so stop cutting. You're not concerned about the kids' welfare, just that their behavior makes you uncomfortable. And so that sends the wrong message as well. So they need to know, not just that you want to help them with the cutting, they want to know that you care about the pain underneath. And that you're willing to hear that, and that you are wanting to help them with that. What I often say to people, deal with the core issue and the symptoms start to take care of themselves. You don't even have to talk about those after a while. Deal with the deep down pain. Next thing I want you to understand, you can send a child to a counselor, but if you're not changing, you're wasting your time sending them to a counselor. Because you want to know what's going to happen is they're going to go to a counselor and they're going to learn all of this stuff, tools to deal with their pain. Those tools only work when you're in a safe environment. They come back home and you haven't changed, and guess what? These tools don't work because now I'm in an unsafe environment. So counselors only work if the child sees you changing, working on yourself, and becoming healthier. Next thing with that, if you're sending them to a counselor and they look at you and go, you are so screwed up, you should be the first one going to a counselor. If you go, then I'll go. But don't be a hypocrite and send me, but not deal with your own stuff. So that you have to consider as well. One of the things to you as parents is this. A lot of places will give you techniques on parenting. And those are good techniques. So if your kid's having a temper tantrum, here's what you do, etc., etc. And they help you in very practical things. Here's what I emphasize all the time to parents. Techniques are good, but in and of themselves, they're never enough. What impacts a child more than techniques is who you are. It's not what you say, it's your attitudes. It's your internal world. They pick up on that. And if you got lots of good techniques, but inside you're a negative person full of self-pity, none of your techniques are going to have any effect on them because they are picking up your core. And that is what you need to be aware of. So the bottom line again is this. Going to a counselor might be helpful, but what your child needs is you to become the safe person who's changing, getting healthier, and is becoming a rock in their life, a healthy sense of stability and security. Question number 3. Am I ever going to get better? I get this one all the time when people start to understand complex trauma, because what happens after they start understanding complex trauma is they go, I've got like 10,000 things that trigger my trauma, and all of a sudden I'm getting triggered all the time, and I realize on a daily basis in a greater way how screwed up I am. Am I ever going to get over this? Am I ever going to be done dealing with complex trauma? Well, I hate to burst your fantasy bubble, but you're probably going to be working on it to some degree till the day you die. Now, I don't mean that to say it's going to be as bad then as it is now, nor am I saying it's going to be as hard then as it is now. If you're working on it now, over time you'll get triggered less. Those triggers will be less intense and less frequent, and you'll feel much better about yourself and much happier all the way around. But there are going to be things that still come up years and years to the end of your life. So I don't know that a person is ever totally healed of complex trauma, because we always have room to grow. We always have issues that have to be worked on, regardless of how much work we've done. But to me, that's not a curse or a prison sentence or a death sentence. That's life. And if I approach it that this is life, it actually turns into some positive things. So we can look at it as a negative, or we can look at it as continuing to grow, which leads to a richer, more satisfying life the more work we do. Okay, now let me go to the fears that many people have in recovery. So in the world of fear, we talk about rational fear and irrational fear. So rational fear is fear that is connected to something and makes sense, okay? So it's rational, it's realistic. Irrational is fear that comes out of baggage from the past that has distortions in it, and that usually becomes very crippling, paralyzing, and it stops you from living a full life, okay? So the first one is actually potentially a healthy fear, and that is the fear of failure. One of the things that I tell clients all the time is that in recovery, we are our own worst enemy. And we are full of vulnerabilities. We can fall and slip in 100 different ways. The more we're aware of that and how weak we are in certain situations, that is a healthy fear. Because now I'm afraid of depending too much on myself. I'm afraid of dropping my guard, of stopping working. I'm afraid of just cutting out people and programs that I need and relying on myself only. That's a healthy fear. Now, the fear of failure can also become an unhealthy fear, and that is this. I'm probably going to fail anyways, I might as well get it over with. That is a fear that is so big that it now has you convinced you'll never succeed. That's when it becomes an unhealthy fear. So both are possible in recovery, but the fear of failure is definitely one of the common fears in recovery. Second one, if you've had a number of relapses in your life, one of the fears that people have is, will I ever get it? Doesn't matter what I try, I seem to fail. And so they can get to a point where they go, I'm afraid that I'm just never going to get this figured out. Maybe I'm just not the right material. I might as well give up trying. And that fear can cause you to lose hope. And once you lose hope, then you give up. And that is a disaster. So what you have to bring into that is this. I have failed and failed and failed. That doesn't mean I'm going to fail forever. That can be, I just have to yet figure out what I need to learn. And so I need to keep working at this. And eventually you will get it. But it is a very discouraging type of thing that causes a lot of fear, many attempts with a lot of failure. One of the things that a lot of people have to bring into that as well is they still have in their mind that recovery should be easy. So I should be able to succeed with no effort, basically. And that has to get broken through, and sometimes failure can bring you to the end of that fantasy. Next fear. A lot of people come into recovery, especially in the world of complex trauma, and they begin to learn all this brand new stuff, okay? And it makes sense. Okay, that's why I was in fight, flight, and freeze. That's why drugs became the solution to all my problems. Okay, it all makes sense. And then they go home and they have a few bad days and they go, who's this Tim Fletcher anyways? Does he even know what he's talking about? And, you know, the fear is this, that I'm going to put all this work into recovery following this whole new thing, and then it's not going to make a difference. So then the fear can become paralyzing, so you go, why bother giving it a chance then? Because I'm afraid it might not be right, and I might put a whole bunch of energy into this, and then it won't work. That's a common thing that can happen for a lot of people. So understand this. If you're going to go into recovery and succeed, you're going to have to open yourself up to new ideas. You're going to have to open yourself up to change and thinking outside of your old box. That's scary because you've never been there, and there's all kinds of voices in our culture today, and you're not sure which one is right. And so it's very easy to be cautious, and that's good. But don't let it get to be a paralyzing fear where you say, I'm not going to try anything different. That becomes the problem. Next one. When I say, what will recovery cost me? I don't mean dollars and cents. What I mean is this. Everybody that comes into recovery says, I just need to figure out how to stop using or drinking, and then I'm good. And then they realize, man, I got anger issues. Okay, I got to deal with my anger. Man, I got wounds from childhood. I got to go back and deal with that. Man, I got losses like crazy. I got to deal with that. Now I got shame. Oh my goodness. What is this recovery going to cost me as far as the painful things I got to look at? This is going to cost me emotionally. This is going to cost me time. This is going to require me to deal with things I really didn't want to deal with. This is going to require me making hard decisions that will cost me friends, family. I don't know if I'm ready for that cost. And so that's why in recovery, a common statement is you got to be willing to go to any lengths. You got to be willing to pay the cost of what it takes to get healthy. But that is a common fear. The next one with that is this. I have talked to many people that know they have abuse issues from way back that they have never dealt with, never looked at. And the fear is, if I go there and open that can of worms, I'm afraid it will destroy me. And that is a legitimate fear. And what I say to clients is this: I never want to take you to that can of worms until you're ready to go there. But even if you're ready to finally go there, it's going to feel overwhelming for a little while. It is going to be very hard, but you'll have tools and you'll have support as you do that. But a lot of people say, I can't go there, it'd be too much. I don't want to open that can of worms, I can't handle it. And so they try to do recovery by never going there. And that's the people that say, the past is the past, I'm just moving forward. And I go, that sounds like good thinking, but that is not accurate thinking. Your past does affect you. And so there are times where you realize, until I deal with that, I will never grow beyond a certain point. But that is a common fear. Next one. If I go there, open that can of worms, I am going to be raw emotions. I am going to melt into a puddle on the floor. I am going to be making myself super vulnerable. I'm afraid I'll get hurt again. I'm afraid that if I open myself up and make myself vulnerable, that the people I am doing it with are going to hurt me. Now, in their mind, everybody they've opened up to in their past has hurt them. So it's easy to conclude that everybody open up in the future will hurt them as well. But you can see that if you follow that logic, then you're never going to deal with stuff. Because you've already decided you're going to get hurt, even though you may not get hurt. And that's where it becomes paralyzing. But that fear is there. So let me just back away and say this. What I want you to see is this. Complex trauma creates the most powerful trump emotion in the people who have complex trauma, and that is fear. Most of them, though, have stuffed that fear down, and they don't think they have any fear. But it is running the show from a very subconscious place. Now you come into recovery, every step you take towards a change stirs up a fear. So recovery is fighting against fear at every step of growth. And that's why I'm doing this talk. So you know what some of those fears are going to be. So you're prepared for it so that when it happens, you're able to process it and walk through it to a healthier place. The next one I think is always interesting. Some have never thought of it, but it goes like this. So you now, because you're changing and growing, you're not yet a normie. The people in Surrey said their new word out there is you now are a complex trauma normie, but you don't fit with normies and you don't fit with your old crowd. So you don't fit in any world now. And so all of a sudden will I ever fit in? I don't fit with my using friends. I don't fit with my family. I don't fit with the normies. Where do I fit? And that can bring a lot of the thinking that I'll have less and less fun. And I just say, you've never been around my wife for very long, and you know the opposite is true. But that is a common fear. And so they go, the only place to get fun is to go back and fit in again with the old crowd. And that can be a disastrous thing. Next one with that is when you realize how screwed up you are, you go, I don't know if I'm ready for a relationship. And I go, good. I'm glad you see that. Put it in writing. You're not ready. Don't say you're ready till you check with me, which nobody ever does. But they see that. And then they hang around for a while and they just get with each passing week, they get to see a clearer and clearer picture that they're more screwed up than they first thought. And then the week before, they're more screwed up than that, et cetera, et cetera. And then they get to a place where they go, will I ever have anybody? Will I ever be ready for a healthy, intimate relationship? And that's a huge fear for people because it taps into the fear of being alone, the fear of not being loved, the fear of feeling abandoned. And so a lot of people, that fear is such a haunting fear for them that they go, it doesn't matter if I'm ready or not, I can't stand this loneliness. But that fear does come as you get to know yourself and your issues better. Okay, I only got a few more. If you're not depressed already, we'll keep going. There are fears related to career. I've had many clients come to me that are working on their resume, and they go from age 16 to 21, worked at co-op gas bar, then there's a blank till 35. And they go, what kind of resume, what do I put for those 15 years of my drug career? And it presents a problem. Then the other thing that happens is a lot of people don't get into serious recovery and get success till they're in their 40s and 50s. And then they go, what am I supposed to do? Nobody wants to hire somebody my age to start out. They want a young guy they can develop. And I don't even know what I'm good at. I've worn masks all my life. I've been in the problem all my life. I thought I knew what I wanted to be, but I tried that. I don't really enjoy it. So I don't even know. I'm like a kid saying, I want to be a fireman, but I don't know if I'm any good at that. And so it's like all of a sudden, you're starting from scratch and figuring out what your career should be when you're in your 50s. And that can create a lot of fear within people. And then connected with that is the fears around all of the legal stuff that you have to deal with. So I don't know many addicts who have nice and neat, happy-ended relationships with exes. There tend to be messy separations, divorces, kids issues. That's got to get sorted out. Then most addicts get involved in some criminal activity, from boosting to whatever, and that can be on their record that's got to get sorted out, that messes up their resume. And all of those things can create stress and anxiety and a lot of fear. And so what a lot of people do is they say, maybe I'll just be like an ostrich and I'll stick my head in the sand and hope it all goes away. You got to just face that stuff one at a time and keep working to get this stuff sorted out. And it might get frustrating and it might feel very discouraging at times, but stick at it and it does eventually get sorted out. And then the final fear is if you never figured it out, using doesn't help your health. It tends to mess up kidneys and livers and lungs and all kinds of different things on top of your brain. And now you got all of this damage done to your body. And a lot of people are afraid to find out how much damage they've got done. I've had clients who are afraid to go to the doctor for a checkup because they're afraid of what they're going to find out. So again, it's if I stick my head in the sand, then maybe nothing bad is wrong with me. But figure that stuff out. There's probably teeth work that needs to be done and all kinds of stuff. And if you face that fear and get all of that sorted out and get a clean bill of health, a huge stress comes off your shoulders. But it is one of the fears of recovery. So how do we deal with these fears? Number one, be kind to yourself. Understand that fear ruled your life. So you're not going to just solve all your fears and get rid of them overnight. Your fear will still get triggered. You will still fall into old behaviors. Don't beat yourself up that you do. Get back up, forgive yourself, get back on track. Be kind to yourself. That is so important. Secondly, it helps to talk to somebody about the fears that you're facing. Somehow as you bring them out into the light and it just makes them more manageable, You get a clear perspective on them. You get more hope in facing them. And then the third thing is know your fear triggers. So there's hundreds, but some of the main ones are things from your past that you remember, or any time that you feel out of control or you feel overwhelmed, stressed out, that can trigger fear in a big way. Or you're in a situation where you feel very vulnerable, or you don't feel in control, or there's conflict. All of that can trigger fear. It's when fear gets triggered that there's that nanosecond response, and you can say and do things in that moment that can do a lot of damage to yourself and others. So the better you know your triggers, the more you're able to catch yourself before the damage is done. And then finally, know the early warning signs if fear is just gradually building. So sometimes fear will get triggered and there'll be a nanosecond. Sometimes fear just gradually builds and builds without you even realizing it until it's too late. So know your early warning signs. So some people, all of a sudden they can't sleep and their mind becomes obsessive. It's the hamster on the hamster wheel, spin, spin, spin. That is a good sign that fear is building. Some even grind their teeth. Others just get super irritable all of a sudden. Fear is part of recovery. Fear is something that you just don't magically make disappear, but you need to learn how to manage it. And a starting place is to know what those fears might be that you are going to face in this new life of recovery. If you haven't been here for the Christian part, I try to tie it to what we talked about in the first half. And so we focused on this fear issue. And the answer to fear is faith, trust, which is something people with complex trauma have great difficulty with, trusting anybody, let alone God. And especially a God that you can't see, and a God that probably you've got a lot of teaching about it, with him being rather angry and judgmental and condemning. And so part of the challenge that I have in working with people in recovery who come out of complex trauma is this trusting God thing is such a big issue for them. And we've talked about it on many occasions already, but I thought I'd come at it tonight from two things in Jesus' life where we see him trusting his Father in situations that apply a lot to us. And they're probably the two most difficult situations that Jesus ever encountered and that we will ever encounter. So I hope I can make it practical for you to begin to see this faith thing, that Jesus did it and how important it is that we learn faith in this way as well, but how difficult it is. I think that probably the two things that people coming out of complex trauma struggle with when it comes to God is that God is a loving God and that God loves them. That is just a concept that is so difficult. And what this walking in a relationship with God and trusting him looks like. So let me take you to the two situations in Jesus' life that he showed trust in his Father. So number one is part of the very beginning of his ministry. We call it the temptation of Jesus. So it started at 30 years of age. Jesus went out into the desert he got baptized and acknowledged to the world that this is the promised Messiah. This is the promised one that God said would come in and rescue the world. And then right after that happened, he got taken out into the desert for 40 years where he fasted for that full 40 years. 40 years, you'd be dead. Sorry, thank you. At least this side's listening. This side didn't say anything. Okay, yeah, 40 days. Let's get that right. Now, I've fasted a few times in my life, never for 40 days. I know somebody that has. I know a couple of people that have fasted for 40 days. And at the end of that, you can just imagine how hungry they would be, how their body just needs that food and that craving. It would almost be like somebody that is in withdrawal, and their body is craving the drug, and that is just obsession for them. So at that moment in time, Satan comes to Jesus and he says, well, you just got presented to the world as God. That means you can do anything. You can do miracles. So you're hungry. You've gone for 40 days without food. I got the solution for you. Here's a couple rocks on the ground. Make them into loaf of bread and have yourself a free meal. And he sets that temptation up. Now I want you to think about that temptation with me, because he wasn't asking Jesus to do anything that was morally wrong. He was just going to be meeting a very legitimate physical need. So on the surface, it doesn't sound like Satan's asking Jesus to do anything wrong or bad. But that's the trick part that we need to understand, because that's often how temptation will come to us. Not as that we're going to do anything bad, but here's what the temptation really was. I want you to step out from surrendering to God and take your will back. And I want you to take care of yourself in ways that you don't even care what God's will is. I want you to put what you want ahead of what God wants for you. And that was the heart of the temptation. But stop and think about that. Number one, it looked like a legitimate thing, that he wasn't doing anything wrong. Secondly, he was saying, this will make you feel good. He was appealing to that limbic brain and saying, I got a way for you to get some instant pleasure, instant gratification. Do you realize that what a temptation is something that is trying to entice you to step outside of healthy into unhealthy, but it makes it look like there's nothing wrong with it, and it sure will give you a lot of fun. And you'll get some instant gratification. So that's the power of temptation. It doesn't seem like there's anything wrong. You're just meeting a need, and it's sure going to make you feel good. That's what's going on here. But then I think he's drawing on a couple innuendos that he's making. Number one, he is saying, don't you have the right to feel happy all the time? Now that's basically what our culture tells us. You have the right to be always happy, always in a place of pleasure. And Jesus, you're not there right now. You're struggling right now. You're hungry, you're tired, you're exhausted. This will just make you feel a little better. And that sounds good. But then there's a second implication, and that is, I thought your father loved you. If your father loved you so much, don't you think he would have taken care of your hunger problems already? Maybe you can't trust your father. Maybe he's not the loving God that you thought. That we get sometimes when we think about our hardships in life and why we want to step outside of healthy, because we're going, God, I don't even think you care about me right now. And we're a little bit mad at God. And then I think he's saying, and this is where it gets really subtle, and I want you to get it. What he is saying to Jesus is this: I want you to think of your life as only being a physical being. Food, water, sex, physical stuff. I don't want you to think that you are a physical being, an emotional being, a relational being, a spiritual being. I want you to think that happiness comes only from the physical world. Now, if you stop and think about that, that is what our culture is telling us today. That happiness is confined to physical pleasure, physical indulgence. And that's what Satan was saying to Jesus. The greatest happiness, and maybe the only happiness, comes from gratifying physical desires. So he is trying to present to Jesus a distorted picture of reality. And that's what temptation is. Now, here's what I want you to understand. Do you realize what our fight is when it comes to faith? What does faith basically mean? Who am I going to believe? Am I going to believe the distorted picture that Satan just presented and is all done up pretty and it's made to look fantastic and it's got a bow on top and it looks wonderful? Or am I going to believe God? That's what life boils down to. There's not a lot of emotions there. Life boils down to, am I going to believe a lie or am I going to believe the truth? And that is the struggle that happens inside of us all the time. And so if you look at every temptation you have, so if I'm sitting there and I go, you know what, I really like an extra helping of food, and something inside says, no, that would be using food for the wrong reasons. Guess what happens in my brain? But it'd feel good. I can get over the consequences. I'll just start dieting tomorrow. And what am I doing? I'm believing the lie. And God says food is necessary to stay alive, but food is not the true source of happiness. So let me take you to what Jesus says is the true source of happiness. He says to Satan, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from God. Now that is so packed with truth that I want to just break it down for you. So what he is saying is this: man does not live by just gratifying physical desires. Life is not just confined to physical. Life is only happy when you bring in spiritual. Life is necessary to follow what comes from God. And therefore, the starting point of happiness is surrender. That's what he's saying. And he's saying to Satan, you're asking me to do something that seems innocent, but what you're asking me to do is step outside of surrender to God and take my will back. That is the flaw in what you're asking me to do. That is the lie, that you're saying happiness is available outside of surrender to God. I won't believe that lie. I believe that happiness is only found in surrender to God. That is the truth, even if it means I have to go without some physical needs being met for a period of time. I will not step outside of surrender. Do you realize that every temptation, that is the struggle? Am I going to believe the lie, or am I going to believe that true happiness really comes from obedience and surrender to God? That's the bottom line. That's what living by faith means. And so what Jesus is bringing back to us is this: we live in a world that says it's all about the physical. God says the physical is important, but the bigger priority is the spiritual. And that has to be the starting point. That has to be the rock that everything else is built on. And if you don't get that piece right, nothing else will work. And so what Jesus is saying is, Satan, you're a dishonest salesman trying to sell me a lemon. I don't buy your lie. Here's the truth. Surrender to God. Follow what comes from God's mouth. The spiritual piece is absolutely the starting point. I think that is such an important thing to understand. Because lots of times we take this whole faith idea and it seems so vague and it seems like it's an emotion or a feeling I should have. Really, it's who am I going to believe? The lie or God? What do I really believe will make me happy? Doing it my way or his way? That's what it boils down to. And so that takes all emotions out. And I have had many discussions with myself where this lie, I know, will give me instant gratification, but I know I'm going to regret it later with lots of guilt. And I go, that's a lie. Am I going to believe it? Or am I going to believe God? Even though that might mean sitting in a bit of pain for a little while. And that's what it boils down to. So that's part one. Part two. I love this. I don't know if you did bedtime prayers with your kids when they're growing up. We did with our kids. We didn't do this one, but this is a common one that many do. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. What is that saying? Kids say that, don't have a clue what it means. Well, let me give you an explanation of that by taking you back to the world of Jesus' time, the Jewish world. Jewish children had a bedtime prayer. And it was this: Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Now, does that sound familiar? Those were the final words Jesus said on the cross before he died. Do you realize just before he died, he prayed a child's prayer? And he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Now, here's what it means. A child is saying, I'm about to close my eyes and go to sleep. And when I go to sleep, I have zero control. I am going to be super vulnerable. I am not going to be alert to protect myself. I am going to be in potentially a very dangerous place. But I need sleep. So while I sleep, I trust my life to your care to watch over me and take care of my soul. That's what they're doing. So every night, a Jewish child is saying, God, I'm ready to give up control. Take care of me while I sleep. So let me take that to what Jesus is doing, okay? Because I want you to understand what happened on that cross and in the hours before he prayed that prayer. Do you realize that in the day before Jesus prayed that prayer, two sets of things happened that both said, God has abandoned me. God does not care about me. He has just gone through being tortured, whipped, crown of thorns, an unjust trial, being deserted by his friends. He has gone through more physical pain and emotional pain than most of us will ever understand. And you go, where are you, God? Why are you allowing all of this happen to me? This doesn't feel much like love. And then on the cross, prior to this final prayer, he says something else. It all goes black and he says, my God, why have you abandoned me? And he's not saying that just as maybe this happened. He is saying God actually abandoned him. Now let me explain that to you. You have to understand the word death. So we think death as the absence of life, okay? It's a disconnect from life. So when you're disconnected from life, you're dead. So when you're disconnected from people, you're dead. It's abandoned. It's not there. When you're disconnected from your emotions, you're dead inside. So death is abandonment or disconnection from something. And so what happened when Jesus was on the cross is God said, the consequence of every who said to me, I don't need you, I'm going to do it my way, and they stepped outside of healthy, they disconnected from me. And as a result, every single person experienced some measure of death. Physical death, we all get someday. Definitely emotional death, spiritual death, because we're all disconnected from the life source, is what it is saying. So on the cross, Jesus said, let me take all you and let me be disconnected from you so I can experience the consequences of everybody's abandonment or disconnection on myself. And God said, okay, I will disconnect from you. Now, do you realize that he's never been disconnected from his Father before? Do you realize there never was any conflict in that relationship before? It was the only perfect, joyful, beautiful relationship in all of eternity. And after having experienced nothing but true, intimate joy every single second for billions of years, he's now abandoned. I can't begin to understand how hard that would have been. So he's feeling all of this abandonment, and he knows he's died spiritually now and taken spiritual death of every death, and he's about to explore, he goes, my spirit, the prayer. Because it feels like you don't care, and you have abandoned me, but I know it's not permanent, because I know your heart. I have lived with you for eternity and got to know your nature. So these circumstances right now seem to contradict your nature, but what I know is your nature doesn't change, so these circumstances will. Even you say I shouldn't. In other words, these circumstances are telling me a lie about you. So I'm going to hang on and believe what I know is true, and I'm going to put more faith in what I know you are than in the circumstances that I am in. Now, isn't that life for us? Is that when we're in negative circumstances, it boils down to, do I believe what history to show, or my faith says, I'm going to believe, put all my weight. So those are two very practical faith lessons that Jesus gives us, and I hope it just helps you in your life right now. Let's pray.